The fuel gauge needle trembled against empty as Lieutenant Elena Vasquez banked her P-51 Mustang hard to starboard, the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly below like a canvas of liquid mercury. Enemy Zeros materialized from the sun's glare like deadly wasps, their engines screaming promises of death. Her radio crackled with static and panic. 3 of her squadron mates were already spiraling toward the unforgiving sea, black smoke trailing behind them like funeral shrouds. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel, Bandit at 2 o'clock high. The voice belonged to Captain Morrison, her wing commander, but it sounded distorted through the interference. Elena's gloved hands gripped the control stick with practiced precision, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might falter. The familiar weight of her father's St. Christopher medal pressed against her chest beneath the flight suit, a tangible reminder of the promises she'd made and the doubts she'd sworn to shatter. The year was 1943, and the world had been bleeding. For what felt like an eternity, Pearl Harbor still haunted American dreams, its smoke and screams echoing through every strategic decision, every training exercise, every moment of quiet before the storm. But here, 30,000 feet above the Pacific Theater, history was about to witness something the military brass had sworn would never happen: a woman in combat, not as a ferry pilot or instructor, but as a hunter in the most lethal game humanity had ever devised. Elena's Mustang, christened Esperanza in flowing script beneath the cockpit, had been her companion through 200 hours of training flights that weren't supposed to exist. The aircraft itself seemed to understand the weight of their shared secret. Every rivet, every curve of aluminum had been touched by hands that believed in impossibilities. The engine's roar had become her lullaby, the instrument panel her most trusted confidant, the endless sky her sanctuary from a world that insisted on limitations. The morning had begun like any other at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, with the sticky humidity that made flight suits cling like second skin, and the perpetual smell of aviation fuel mixing with tropical decay. Elena had woken before dawn in the tent she shared with 3 male pilots who still treated her presence like an elaborate joke that had gone on too long. They called her Lucky Charm when they thought she couldn't hear, believing her role was purely ceremonial, a pretty face to boost morale, nothing more. But Staff Sergeant Rodriguez knew better. The weathered mechanic with oil permanently embedded under his fingernails had watched Elena strip and rebuild an engine in record time during her first week. He'd seen her calculate fuel consumption rates in her head while other pilots fumbled for slide rules. Most importantly, he'd witnessed her land a damaged training aircraft in crosswinds that had seasoned veterans white-knuckling their controls. Rodriguez had been the one to quietly ensure her ammunition was live rounds, instead of the training blanks everyone assumed she carried. "They're coming around for another pass." Morrison's voice cut through her thoughts, urgent and strained. Elena could see them now, 6 Japanese fighters in perfect formation, their rising sun emblems glinting like drops of blood in the afternoon light. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her breathing remained controlled, methodical. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when every eye would be watching, not when failure meant more than just her own death. The lead Zero broke formation first, diving toward her with an aggression that spoke of desperation. Japan was losing this war. Everyone knew it, though nobody spoke it aloud. Their pilots were younger now, their training abbreviated, their fuel supplies dwindling. But desperation made enemies dangerous in ways that careful strategy never could. Elena pulled back on the stick, climbing into a chandelle that would either give her the advantage of altitude or expose her belly to enemy fire. Her mind flashed to the letter she'd written to her mother but never sent, the one hidden in her footlocker beneath regulation underwear, and a photograph of her family's small ranch outside El Paso. In that letter, she'd tried to explain why she'd lied about her gender on enlistment papers, why she'd bound her chest and deepened her voice, and practiced walking with a swagger that felt like wearing someone else's skin. She'd attempted to capture the feeling of being told no so many times that the word had lost all meaning, becoming just another obstacle to navigate around rather than through. The Zero's guns opened up, orange muzzle flashes winking in this cockpit like deadly fireflies. Bullets stitched a line through the air where Elena's aircraft had been milliseconds before, close enough that she could hear their passage over the engine noise. Time dilated, stretching each second into an eternity of hyper-awareness. She could smell her own sweat, taste copper fear on her tongue, feel the Mustang responding to her inputs like an extension of her own nervous system. Banking hard left, Elena dropped her flaps and pulled the aircraft into a tight spiral that would have made her instructors proud if any of them had known she existed. The G-forces pressed her into the seat, threatening to steal consciousness, but she'd trained for this moment in simulators and training flights that officially never happened. Major Katherine Williams, one of only 3 women in the entire Pacific Theater with combat authorization, had personally overseen Elena's preparation, knowing that success or failure would determine whether other women would ever get the same opportunity. Williams had been a test pilot before the war, breaking records and hearts with equal efficiency. She'd fought tooth and nail for the right to establish a small, classified program that would evaluate women's potential in combat roles. Elena was their proof of concept, their hope wrapped in flight leather and determination. If she succeeded, doors might open. If she failed, those doors would be welded shut for generations to come. The Zero pilot was good, better than Elena had expected. He'd anticipated her spiral and positioned himself for a deflection shot that would be nearly impossible to avoid. But Elena had studied every combat report, every tactical manual, every after-action review she could get her hands on. She knew that most pilots thought in 2 dimensions, forgetting that the sky offered 3. Instead of continuing her spiral, she suddenly rolled inverted and pulled through, diving toward the ocean in a split-ass that brought her underneath and behind her pursuer. Her finger found the gun trigger, a simple switch that would either make history or end it. The Mustang's 6.50 caliber machine guns had been synchronized and bore-sighted by Rodriguez himself, each weapon loaded with a mixture of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. Elena had practiced on towed targets and aerial sleeves, but paper silhouettes were vastly different from an aircraft with a human being inside, someone who probably had a family, dreams, fears identical to her own. The Zero filled her gun sight, growing larger with each passing second. Elena's training whispered calculations, lead angle, deflection, rate of closure. But beneath the mathematics lived something more primal, a hunter's instinct that had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with survival. She pressed the trigger, feeling the aircraft shudder as 6 streams of .50 caliber death reached out across the sky. The enemy fighters seemed to stumble in flight, pieces of aluminum and plexiglass separating from the airframe like metallic confetti. Black smoke began pouring from the engine cowling, and Elena could see the pilot fighting his controls, trying to maintain altitude. For a moment, she felt a stab of something that might have been regret, until she remembered the smoking remains of Pearl Harbor, the casualty reports that arrived daily, the faces of friends who hadn't come back from previous missions. The Zero rolled over and began its final descent toward the Pacific, trailing smoke and flames. Elena didn't watch it hit the water. There would be time for reflection later, time to process what she'd just done and what it meant. Right now, 5 more enemy aircraft were converging on her position, and Morrison's voice on the radio was shouting warnings that sounded increasingly desperate. But as Elena pulled up from her dive and scanned the sky for her next target, she felt something she'd never experienced before, a sense of absolute rightness, as if every moment of her life had been leading to this instant. The doubts that had plagued her training, the whispered conversations about women's limitations. Bureaucratic battles fought in conference rooms. She'd never seen all of it fell away like shed skin. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was born to do. And the war was just getting started. 3 months earlier, Elena Maria Vasquez had been Airman First Class Eddie Vasquez, just another face in the crowd of recruits learning to march in formation at Randolph Field, Texas. The transformation hadn't been as difficult as she'd expected, binding her chest each morning with medical tape, keeping her hair regulation short, practicing the careful swagger that men seemed to perform without conscious thought. The hardest part had been the voice, dropping her natural alto into a range that wouldn't attract attention during roll call or casual conversation. Her bunkmate, Private Jimmy Chun from San Francisco's Chinatown, had noticed her habit of facing away while changing clothes, but attributed it to modesty rather than anatomy. Jimmy was 19, barely old enough to shave, with dreams of becoming a fighter pilot that glowed in his eyes like captured starlight. He talked endlessly about his girlfriend back home, a girl named Susan who worked in her family's laundry and sent letters that smelled faintly of jasmine and hope. "You ever been in love, Eddie?" Jimmy had asked one sweltering Texas night, their conversation floating through the darkness between their cots. The barracks held 30 men, but after lights out, whispered confessions created islands of intimacy in the regulation space. Elena had stared at the ceiling, thinking about Maria Santos, the daughter of her family's neighbors who had taught her to dance at parish socials and whose laugh had made her stomach flutter in ways she'd never understood. "Maybe," she'd answered carefully, keeping her voice in that practiced lower register. "But the war makes everything complicated." Jimmy had nodded in the darkness, understanding in the way that only young people facing mortality could understand. They'd talked about flying then, about the sensation of leaving Earth behind and existing in a realm where normal rules didn't apply. Jimmy dreamed of aerial dogfights and ticker tape parades. Elena dreamed of proving that courage had no gender. That skill spoke louder than convention. Her days at Randolph had followed rigid patterns designed to transform civilians into soldiers. Reveille at 0530, calisthenics that left muscles screaming, classroom instruction in navigation and aircraft, systems, drill practice that turned individual bodies into a single coordinated organism. Elena excelled at everything except the camaraderie that seemed to develop naturally among the other recruits. She couldn't participate in the crude jokes about women, couldn't join the speculation about weekend passes and local girls, couldn't be one of the boys in ways that had nothing to do with flying and everything to do with belonging. Instead, she became known as the quiet one, the serious student who studied flight manuals while others played poker or wrote letters home. Flight instructors noticed her dedication immediately. Sergeant Major Williams, no relation to the Major Williams she would later meet, had pulled her aside after her third solo flight. "Vasquez," he'd said, his weathered face showing the kind of respect that couldn't be faked. "I've been teaching kids to fly for 15 years. You've got something special up there, natural instincts most pilots never develop." Elena had accepted the praise with careful neutrality, knowing that enthusiasm might invite closer scrutiny. But inside, her heart had soared higher than any aircraft. Flying wasn't just something she could do, it was something she was meant to do. As natural as breathing and infinitely more exhilarating. Her evenings were spent in solitude, writing letters to her family that carefully edited out any details that might reveal her secret. She told them about the weather, the food, the basic training routine. She didn't mention the constant vigilance required to maintain her disguise, the way she'd learned to think twice before every casual gesture, the exhaustion that came from being perpetually on guard. Her mother, Rosa Vasquez, wrote back with news from the ranch and updates about neighbors' sons who had shipped out to various theaters of war. Elena's younger brother Miguel had tried to enlist but been rejected due to asthma, a rejection that had left him bitter and ashamed. Her father, Carlos, worked double shifts at the aircraft factory in El Paso, manufacturing parts for the same planes his eldest child was learning to fly. In her mother's letters, Elena could read between the lines of worry and pride. Rosa had always known her daughter was different, had watched her prefer overalls to dresses, mechanics to dolls, adventure stories to romance novels. But knowing and accepting were different creatures entirely, and Elena wondered how her mother would react to learning that her daughter had chosen a path that could end in a telegram beginning with, "We regret to inform you." The contradiction between her public and private selves created a constant state of emotional vertigo. During flight training, she felt most like herself, confident, capable, utterly alive. But in the barracks, during meals, throughout the endless hours of military routine, she performed a character that grew more exhausting with each passing day. Jimmy Chun became her anchor without knowing it. His genuine friendship, untainted by romantic complications or gender expectations, reminded her that connection was possible even within deception. When he received a Dear John letter from Susan, Elena sat with him through the night, offering comfort in the careful way she'd learned to navigate emotional intimacy. "She says she can't wait anymore," Jimmy had whispered, holding the letter like a wounded bird. "Says she needs someone who can promise to come back, someone who isn't going to war." Elena had wanted to tell him that promises were luxury soldiers couldn't afford, that love should be stronger than fear, that Susan was a fool for letting war steal her happiness. Instead, she'd offered the kind of stoic male support she'd observed in movies and novels. Her loss, Jimmy. Any girl who can't see what she's giving up isn't worth the heartbreak. But later, alone in the latrine where she could drop her guard. For precious minutes, Elena had wept for Jimmy's pain and for her own impossible situation. How could she ever have a normal relationship when her entire existence was built on deception? How could she love someone who didn't know who she really was? The physical demands of training pushed her body to its limits and beyond. The binding around her chest made breathing difficult during intense exercise, but she'd learned to compensate, to push through discomfort that her male counterparts couldn't imagine. Her hands developed calluses from weapons training and aircraft maintenance. Her shoulders broadened from endless push-ups and pull-ups. She became a perfect imitation of a young man, even as her spirit remained defiantly feminine. Flight training intensified as the weeks passed. Elena mastered basic aircraft trainers with forgiving flight characteristics and simple systems. But she dreamed of fighters, of aircraft that demanded split-second decisions and rewarded aggression with survival. She studied combat manuals that weren't officially part of the curriculum, learning about energy management and deflection shooting, about the psychology of aerial warfare and the tactics that separated aces from casualties. Her instructors began to take notice. Captain Reynolds, a former airline pilot with over 3,000 hours of flight time, recommended her for advanced training. "This kid has the reflexes of a natural fighter pilot," he'd written in her evaluation. "Recommend immediate assignment to single-engine combat aircraft program." The recommendation had created its own problems. Advanced training meant increased scrutiny, medical examinations that could expose her secret, psychological evaluations that might reveal inconsistencies in her carefully constructed identity. Elena had volunteered for every dangerous assignment she could find, hoping that exceptional performance might overshadow any irregularities in her background. She'd become expert at deflecting personal questions, at steering conversations toward safe topics like aircraft performance or tactical theory. Her fellow trainees saw her as ambitious and slightly aloof, someone who took the war more seriously than seemed entirely healthy. They respected her flying skills while finding her personality somewhat impenetrable. The loneliness was the hardest part. Elena had always been social, someone who drew energy from relationships and shared experiences. Now she lived in a bubble of careful isolation, connecting with others only through the carefully filtered persona she'd created. She watched Jimmy make friends, join informal groups, develop the bonds that would carry him through the war. She remained on the outside, observing rather than participating, analyzing rather than simply being. At night, when the barracks filled with the sounds of sleeping men, Elena would sometimes touch the St. Christopher medal her father had given her before she left home. Carlos Vasquez had pressed it into her palm with hands that smelled of motor oil and hope, telling her to stay safe and make the family proud. He'd had no idea that his son would be taking those words in directions he'd never imagined. The medal had belonged to Elena's grandfather, a man who'd crossed the border with nothing but determination and had built a life through sheer stubborn will. 3 generations of Vasquez men had worn it through various struggles: immigration, the Depression, now war. Elena was the first woman to carry it, though nobody knew that except her. She wondered if her grandfather's spirit would approve of her deception, or condemn it as dishonor. Her dreams were filled with flying, soaring through clouds that looked like cotton candy, engaging in aerial ballets with enemy aircraft that became partners rather than opponents, landing on airfields where people cheered, not because she was a woman who had succeeded despite the odds, but simply because she was a pilot who had done her job well. But she always woke to the reality of careful performance, of measuring every word and gesture, of existing in a world that had no place for who she really was. The war had created opportunities for women in factories, in support roles, in positions that had been unthinkable just years before. But the cockpit of a fighter aircraft remained forbidden territory, defended by traditions and prejudices that seemed immutable. Elena had decided to challenge those barriers not through protest or political action, but through simple, undeniable competence. She would be so good, so obviously capable, that arguments against her participation would crumble under the weight of necessity. The war needed pilots. She was a pilot. Everything else was just bureaucratic noise. As her training neared completion, Elena had volunteered for every dangerous assignment available. She'd requested overseas deployment, combat zones, anything that would put her skills to the test in circumstances where performance mattered more than politics. The request had been approved with surprising speed. The Pacific Theater needed experienced pilots, and questions of identity seemed less important than questions of survival. The first sign of trouble had come during Elena's medical examination. At Henderson Field, California, the final stop before deployment to the Pacific Theater, Dr. Margaret Ashford, one of only a handful of female physicians in the military medical corps, had reviewed Elena's file with the kind of attention to detail that made bureaucrats nervous and imposters terrified. "Interesting medical history, Airman Vasquez," Dr. Ashford had said, her gray eyes scanning the documents with professional curiosity. "You've managed to avoid routine physical examinations for most of your training period. That's quite an accomplishment in an organization that loves its paperwork." Elena had maintained her composure, though her pulse hammered against her throat like a caged bird. "Just lucky timing, ma'am. Always seemed to be scheduled for flight training during examination periods." Dr. Ashford had smiled an expression that somehow managed to be both warm and predatory. "Well, we can't have pilots deploying without proper medical clearance. Strip down to your underwear and let's get this completed." The examination room had suddenly felt smaller than a fighter cockpit, its white walls closing in like the jaws of a trap. Elena had known this moment would come eventually, had rehearsed explanations and backup plans, but facing the reality felt different than any simulation. Her hands had moved to her shirt buttons with mechanical precision, buying time to think through options that ranged from confession to desertion. "Actually, ma'am," Elena had said, inspiration striking like lightning, "I've been dealing with some skin irritation from the flight suit material. Rash across my chest and back. Might be contagious, some kind of contact dermatitis. Maybe we Should postpone until it clears up? Dr. Ashford had studied Elena's face with the intensity of someone trained to detect deception. Rash, you say? Let me take a look. I've seen plenty of contact dermatitis. Usually responds well to simple treatment. The moment had stretched like taffy, sweet and dangerous. Elena had realized that her luck, the timing, the bureaucratic oversights, the well-meaning instructors who'd fast-tracked her through training, was finally running out. But before she could formulate another excuse, the examination room door had burst open with the kind of authority that made everyone stand at attention. Major Katherine Williams had entered like a storm front, her presence filling the small space with barely contained energy. Elena had recognized her immediately from photographs and reputation, one of the most accomplished test pilots in the country, a woman who'd earned her position through skill that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Dr. Ashford, Major Williams had said, her voice carrying the kind of command authority that ended discussions before they began. I need to borrow Airman Vasquez for a classified briefing. Medical examination will need to be rescheduled. Elena had never been so grateful for military protocol in her life. She'd redressed quickly while the two women exchanged words in voices too low to overhear. But the tension between them had been palpable. Dr. Ashford had clearly wanted to complete her examination, while Major Williams had seemed determined to prevent it. The power struggle had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its resolution would change Elena's life forever. Come with me, airmen, Major Williams had ordered, leading Elena through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly through the administrative heart of Hamilton Field. They'd walked in silence past offices filled with the machinery of war clerks, typing orders, officers studying maps, telephone operators connecting conversations that might determine the fate of thousands. Major Williams had led her to a secure conference room guarded by military police whose expression suggested they'd seen enough classified material to understand the weight of secrets. Inside, Elena had found herself facing a panel of officers whose ranks ranged from captain to full colonel, their faces showing the kind of wartime weariness that came from making impossible decisions daily. Sit down, Vasquez, Colonel Harrison had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. The nameplate on his uniform identified him as the base commander, but his presence suggested responsibilities that extended far beyond Hamilton Field. We need to discuss your unique situation. Elena's heart had stopped, then resumed beating with the irregular rhythm of panic. Her carefully constructed identity was about to crumble, her dreams dissolving like sugar in rain. She'd prepared speeches about duty and capability, about the war's need for every skilled pilot, regardless of gender. But faced with actual discovery, words had abandoned her entirely. We know who you are, Major Williams had said, her tone neither accusatory nor supportive, simply factual. Elena Maria Vasquez, age 22, graduated from El Paso High School with honors, worked as a mechanic at your family's ranch before enlisting under false pretenses. Dr. Ashford isn't the first medical professional to notice inconsistencies in your file. The room had spun slightly, reality reorganizing itself around this new paradigm where her secret was no longer secret. Elena had gripped the edge of the conference table, needing something solid to anchor herself while everything she'd believed about her situation shifted beneath her. The question, Colonel Harrison had continued, is what we do with this information. Normally, fraudulent enlistment results in immediate discharge and possible criminal charges. But these aren't normal times, and you aren't a normal case. Major Williams had opened a file thick with documents. Elena had never seen flight evaluations, instructor recommendations, performance analyses that painted a picture of exceptional ability wrapped in extraordinary deception. Your flight scores are in the top 5% of all pilot trainees. Your mechanical aptitude exceeds most aircraft maintenance specialists. Your tactical understanding demonstrates a natural grasp of aerial warfare theory. More importantly, Captain Morrison had added. Elena recognized him now as the pilot who would later become her wing commander. We're losing experienced pilots faster than we can replace them. The Pacific Theater needs every qualified fighter pilot we can field, regardless of unconventional circumstances. Elena had found her voice, though it sounded strange in her own ears, higher than the masculine register she'd maintained for months, more naturally her own. What are you asking me to do? Colonel Harrison had leaned forward, his expression serious enough to stop conversations in neighboring rooms. We're asking you to become part of a classified program. Officially, you'll remain Airman Eddie Vasquez. Unofficially, you'll be our proof of concept for women in combat roles. If you succeed, you'll open doors for others. If you fail, the doors slam shut for generations, Major Williams had finished. No pressure. The weight of representation had settled on Elena's shoulders like a lead blanket. She wouldn't just be fighting for her own survival, but for the possibilities of every woman who dreamed of following in her contrails. Success would validate arguments for gender equality that social progressives had been making for decades. Failure would reinforce prejudices that might take centuries to overcome. There are conditions, Colonel Harrison had continued. Your identity remains classified. Your success or failure will be attributed to your male persona. You'll receive no official recognition, no medals with your real name, no place in the history books as Elena Vasquez. Are you willing to accept those terms? Elena had thought about her grandfather's medal, about her father's dreams for his children, about Maria Santos and the life she might have lived if she'd been content with conventional expectations. The choice had felt simultaneously enormous and inevitable, like standing at the edge of a cliff while knowing that jumping was the only option that led forward. Yes, sir, she'd answered, the words carrying more finality than wedding vows. The briefing had continued for 3 hours, covering operational security, communication protocols, and the delicate balance of maintaining her masculine identity while serving in a combat role. Elena would be assigned to a squadron based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, flying P-51 Mustangs in support of Pacific Theater operations. Her commanding officers would know her true identity, but the information would be compartmentalized. On a need-to-know basis, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been brought into the program specifically to support her mission. The veteran mechanic had experience with unconventional situations. He'd served in the Spanish Civil War before joining the U.S. military, had seen women fight as equals in circumstances where ideology mattered more than tradition. His job would be ensuring that Elena's aircraft received the maintenance and modifications necessary for combat operations. Rodriguez knows more about aircraft systems than most engineers, Major Williams had explained during a private conversation after the formal briefing. He'll also serve as your informal advisor on maintaining your cover identity. Trust him, but remember that operational security applies to everyone, including allies. The flight to Guadalcanal had been Elena's first taste of the Pacific theaters. Vast distances and strategic complexity. Island hopping across thousands of miles of ocean. She'd seen firsthand the massive logistical effort required to project American power across the world's largest ocean. Each fuel stop had revealed another piece of the enormous machine dedicated to defeating Japan's supply depots, communication centers, maintenance facilities, hospitals treating casualties from battles whose names would become part of history. Henderson Field itself had been a revelation of organized chaos. The airstrip had been carved from jungle and coral, its runways constantly under repair from enemy bombing raids and the corrosive effects of tropical weather. Aircraft of every description lined the flight line: fighters, bombers, transport planes, and reconnaissance aircraft, all bearing the scars of combat operations. Elena's squadron, the 357th Fighter Squadron, had initially treated her assignment with skepticism bordering on hostility. Squadron leader Captain Thompson, a veteran of the European theater with 12 confirmed kills, had made his position clear during her first briefing. "I don't know what political games are being played back in Washington," Thompson had said, his Texas drawl carrying undertones of resentment, "but this is a combat unit, not a training school. We've lost 6 pilots in the last month. I need killers, not experiments." The other squadron members had been more subtle in their disapproval, but Elena had felt their evaluation with every interaction. They'd watched her aircraft handling during formation flights, tested her knowledge during tactical discussions, measured her nerve during increasingly dangerous missions. She was the outsider, the unknown quantity in a unit where trust meant survival. Her first combat mission had been a milk run escorting transport aircraft to a supply drop behind enemy lines, an assignment typically given to new pilots to ease them into combat operations. Elena had performed flawlessly, maintaining formation discipline and radio protocol while scanning constantly for enemy threats that never materialized. The mission had been successful but unremarkable, exactly the kind of routine operation that built experience without creating heroes. But routine missions had a way of becoming extraordinary without warning. Elena's third escort assignment had been interrupted by intelligence reports of Japanese fighter activity in the target area. What should have been a simple supply run had suddenly become a fighting retreat, with Elena and her wingmen facing off against superior numbers while protecting vulnerable transport aircraft. The engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes, but those minutes had contained lifetimes of decision-making and consequences. Elena had shot down her first enemy aircraft, a Zero that had made the mistake of turning with a Mustang in a contest of sustained maneuverability. The victory had been clean, professional, and emotionally devastating in ways she hadn't anticipated. Killing another human being, even an enemy combatant, had created a psychological wound that no amount of training could have prepared her for. Elena had spent the following night staring at the ceiling of her tent, replaying the moment when the enemy pilot's aircraft had burst into flames, wondering about the person inside, someone's son, possibly someone's father, certainly someone who'd believed his cause was just as fervently as she believed in hers. Captain Thompson's attitude toward her had shifted after that mission, though his change had been subtle enough that casual observers might have missed it. He'd begun including her in tactical planning sessions, asking for her opinions on mission parameters, treating her less like an experimental addition and more like a squadron member. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. "Good shooting out there, Vasquez," he'd said after reviewing her combat report. "Clean kill, no wasted ammunition, good situational awareness. Keep that up and you might just survive this war." High praise from Thompson, Elena had learned, came in the form of not being told explicitly that you were a liability. His approval had been measured in increased responsibilities and decreased supervision, the military equivalent of acceptance into a very exclusive fraternity. But acceptance within her squadron had created new challenges. Success bred visibility, and visibility attracted attention from higher headquarters that preferred their experimental programs to remain invisible. Elena's combat effectiveness was becoming difficult to ignore, and difficult to ignore presented problems for maintaining the operational security that kept her identity classified. The tension had come to a head during a staff meeting at Henderson Field's command center, where Elena had been summoned to brief senior officers on tactical observations from recent combat missions. The room had been filled with colonels and generals whose decisions affected thousands of lives, men who'd built careers on understanding the complexities of warfare and the capabilities of their subordinates. Airman Vasquez, General MacArthur's Pacific Theater representative, had said, studying Elena with the kind of intensity that dissected personalities like anatomical specimens, "Your combat reports demonstrate unusual tactical sophistication for someone with limited operational experience. Your recommendations have proven consistently accurate. Where did you develop this expertise?" Elena had felt the weight of dozens of eyes, each pair belonging to someone trained to detect deception and evaluate capability. Her answer would need to satisfy their curiosity without revealing information that could compromise her identity or the classified program that had put her in a combat role. Sir, I've studied every combat report and tactical analysis I could access. I believe understanding the enemy's patterns and capabilities is essential for survival. I've also had excellent instruction from Captain Thompson and other experienced pilots in the squadron. The general had nodded slowly, but his expression suggested that her answer had raised more questions than it had resolved. Interesting. We'll be watching your career development with considerable interest, Airman Vasquez. Considerable interest. Elena had left the briefing knowing that her situation had become more precarious. Success was attracting exactly the kind of attention that her mission required her to avoid. She was caught in an impossible contradiction. She needed to excel, to justify the program that had given her the opportunity to serve. But excellence created visibility that threatened the operational security essential to the program's continuation. The psychological pressure of living a double life while performing in one of the war's most demanding roles had begun taking its toll. Elena found herself checking and rechecking her masculine mannerisms, second-guessing casual conversations, analyzing every interaction for potential security breaches. The constant vigilance was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with combat operations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had become her lifeline, the one person with whom she could drop her guard for precious minutes while discussing aircraft maintenance or mission planning. His workshop had become a sanctuary where Elena could exist as herself, even if only briefly, even if only in the context of technical discussions about engine performance and weapons systems. "You're carrying too much weight, Lieutenant," Rodriguez had observed during one of their regular maintenance sessions. Elena's promotion had come through quietly, without ceremony, reflecting her combat performance while maintaining her cover identity. This war is hard enough without trying to prove points that shouldn't need proving. "I can't afford to fail," Elena had replied, her voice carrying the strain of months spent walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss of consequences. "Too many people are depending on what happens here." Rodriguez had nodded, understanding the burden of representation in ways that went beyond military service. "My wife fought in Spain," he'd said quietly, sharing information that violated several regulations about personal disclosure. "Took a bullet in the shoulder and kept fighting because she knew that women's participation in the resistance would be judged by her performance. She understood about carrying other people's dreams." The conversation had been interrupted by air raid sirens, Japanese bombers approaching Henderson Field in another attempt to disrupt Allied operations. Elena had run to her aircraft, strapping herself into the cockpit of Esperanza while anti-aircraft guns opened up against the evening sky. The raid had been beaten off, but not before enemy bombs had destroyed 2 transport aircraft and damaged the field's radar installation. Combat had become routine, but routine didn't diminish its intensity. Elena had engaged enemy aircraft in single combat and group engagements, had strafed ground targets, and provided close air support for Marine infantry operations. Each mission had added to her experience and her reputation, building a record of achievement that existed under a name that wasn't her own. The contradiction had become more painful with each passing week. Elena was becoming one of the squadron's most effective pilots, someone whose tactical recommendations influenced mission planning and whose combat skills were recognized throughout the group. But the recognition came to Eddie Vasquez, a fictional character who existed only in military records and official reports. Her family's letters had begun mentioning news reports about heroic pilots in the Pacific Theater, wondering if their son might be involved in the dramatic air battles they read about in the newspapers. Elena's mother had sent clippings from the El Paso Times, articles describing aerial victories achieved by pilots, whose names were classified, but whose actions were becoming legendary. "Your father is so proud," Rosa Vasquez had written in her most recent letter. He tells everyone at the factory that his son is fighting the Japanese, keeping America safe. Miguel still talks about joining up when his asthma gets better. We pray for you every night, Neo. Come home safe to us. Elena had held that letter until her hands trembled, reading between the lines of love and expectation. Her parents were proud of a son who didn't exist, mourning the daughter they believed had chosen a conventional path. The deception had grown beyond military necessity into something that felt like betrayal of the people, who'd raised her to value honesty above convenience. The breaking point had come during a mission that should have been straightforward bomber escort to a Japanese supply depot on a contested island north of Guadalcanal. Elena had been flying wing position for Captain Morrison, maintaining formation. Discipline while scanning for enemy interceptors that intelligence reports suggested might not materialize. But intelligence had been wrong. 24 Japanese fighters had risen from concealed airfields, climbing to intercept the bomber formation with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of experienced pilots and careful planning. Elena had found herself in the kind of large-scale aerial battle that transformed individual skill into collective survival, where split-second decisions determine not just personal fate but mission success. The engagement had developed into a swirling melee of aircraft, separated by physics and connected by tracer bullets. Elena had maneuvered through the chaos with an instinct that seemed to transcend training, her aircraft responding to control. Inputs that anticipated enemy movements before they fully developed. She'd engaged 3 different Japanese fighters in the space of 5 minutes, scoring hits on 2 and forcing the third to break off its attack on a damaged B-25 bomber. But it was her 4th engagement that had changed everything. A Japanese ace, someone whose aircraft bore the markings of multiple victories, had singled her out for personal attention, pursuing her through a series of aerial maneuvers that tested both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. The engagement had lasted 8 minutes that felt like hours. With neither pilot able to gain decisive advantage, Elena had finally ended the contest through a maneuver that Captain Thompson would later describe as either brilliant or insane. Rolling inverted at the top of a chandelle, she'd pulled through into a split-S that brought her aircraft dangerously close to the ocean surface, using the Earth itself as cover while positioning for a climbing attack that caught her opponent completely off guard. The Japanese pilot had been good enough to recognize defeat when it stared him in the cockpit. Elena had seen him bail out of his burning aircraft, his parachute deploying properly as he descended toward the Pacific. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, she'd circled his position until air-sea rescue aircraft arrived, ensuring that a worthy opponent would survive to fight another day or spend the war in prisoner-of-war camps. The mission had been a tactical success. The bomber formation had reached its target and returned with minimal losses. But Elena's performance had attracted attention that she couldn't deflect or minimize. Her aircraft had returned with evidence. Of multiple engagements, her gun camera footage had captured remarkable aerial combat sequences, and her tactical radio communications had demonstrated situational awareness that impressed everyone who reviewed them. Vasquez, Captain Thompson had said during the post-mission briefing, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. That was either the best flying I've seen in 20 years or the luckiest. Either way, you're going to have people asking questions we might not want to answer. The questions had come from sources Elena hadn't anticipated. War correspondents had begun requesting interviews with the mysterious pilot whose combat reports read like adventure novels. Hollywood representatives had contacted the military about potential movie rights. Most concerning, a congressional subcommittee on military efficiency had begun investigating exceptional individual performance as part of their oversight responsibilities. Major Williams had arrived at Henderson Field 3 days later, her presence indicating that Elena's situation had escalated beyond local command authority. They'd met in the secure communications center, surrounded by equipment that connected. Guadalcanal to military commands around the globe. Their conversation protected by classification levels that most personnel would never access. "You're becoming too visible," Major Williams had said without preamble, her directness cutting through military courtesy to address facts that couldn't be softened by protocol. "Your combat record is drawing attention from people who don't know about our program and wouldn't approve if they did." Elena had understood the implications immediately. Success was threatening the very mission it was supposed to validate. Her effectiveness as a combat pilot was creating security risks that might force program termination, ending not just her own military career, but any chance for other women to follow her path. "What are my options?" Elena had asked, though she'd suspected that her choices were being presented rather than requested. Transfer to a training command stateside. Officially, you'd be sharing your combat experience with new pilots. Unofficially, you'd be removed from situations where your performance might compromise operational security. The suggestion had felt like exile disguised as promotion. Elena would be safe, her secret would remain protected, and the experimental program could continue with someone else, someone whose achievements might be less spectacular and therefore less dangerous to institutional stability. Or, Elena had asked, sensing that Major Williams was offering alternatives that came with their own complications. Or you continue flying combat missions with the understanding that discovery becomes increasingly likely with each engagement. If your identity is compromised, the program ends and you face court-martial for fraudulent enlistment. No protection, no consideration for your service record, no acknowledgement of what you've accomplished. Elena had walked to the communication center's window, looking out at Henderson Field's flight line where dozens of aircraft waited for missions that would determine the Pacific War's trajectory. Her Mustang sat among them, Esperanza painted in letters that had become familiar to ground crews and pilots throughout the theater. The aircraft had become an extension of herself, a manifestation of dreams that had seemed impossible just months earlier. "There's a third option," Elena had said, the words forming as she spoke them, shaped by weeks of thinking about impossible choices and their inevitable consequences. "What if we stop hiding?" Major Williams had studied Elena's reflection in the window, her expression unreadable. "Explain." "The war's changing. We're winning, but it's taking longer and costing more than anyone expected. The military needs every advantage it can find. What if women in combat roles isn't a liability to be hidden, but an asset to be developed?" The conversation that followed had lasted through the night and into the following morning, ranging across topics that included military policy, social change, political consequences, and the practical realities of institutional transformation. Elena had argued for disclosure and expansion, revealing her identity and using her success to justify broader inclusion of women in combat roles. Major Williams had presented counter-arguments based on decades of experience with military bureaucracy and social resistance to change. She'd described the political battles that had been necessary just to establish their small experimental program, the institutional opposition that could destroy careers and end opportunities if managed incorrectly. "You're asking me to bet everything on a strategy that might work," Major Williams had finally said. "But if it fails, the consequences extend far beyond your individual situation." Elena had understood the weight of that responsibility. Her decision wouldn't just affect her own future, but the possibilities available to every woman who dreamed of serving in roles that tradition had reserved for men. The choice had felt simultaneously personal and historic, individual and collective. "I need to think about it," Elena had said, knowing that her thinking time was limited by circumstances beyond her control. The decision had been made for her 2 days later, when a Japanese bombing raid had caught Henderson Field during a shift change, targeting aircraft and personnel with devastating precision. Elena had been in the squadron ready room when the first bombs hit, throwing her to the ground as concussions shattered windows and shook the building's foundation, racing toward the flight line. She'd seen Esperanza engulfed in flames from a direct hit that had also destroyed 2 other aircraft and killed Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. The veteran mechanic had been performing routine maintenance when the bombs arrived, dying instantly in the explosion that consumed the aircraft he'd maintained with such professional care. Elena had knelt beside Rodriguez's body while the air raid continued around them, feeling something fundamental break inside her chest. The man who'd been her anchor, her connection to authenticity in a world built on necessary deception, was gone. His death had stripped away illusions about the war's romantic aspects, leaving only the brutal mathematics of survival and sacrifice. But Rodriguez's death had also clarified her choice with absolute finality. He believed in what they were doing, had risked his own career to support a program that challenged institutional limitations. His sacrifice demanded completion of the mission they'd shared, regardless of personal consequences. Elena had stood up from Rodriguez's body with a decision that felt carved from the same coral that formed Henderson Field's runways. She would continue flying combat missions until the war ended or circumstances ended her participation. She would be the best pilot she could be, regardless of recognition or official acknowledgement. And she would trust that history would eventually make space for truths that the present couldn't accommodate. The raid had ended with Henderson Field damaged but operational, its personnel shaken, but determined to continue the mission that had brought them to this remote corner of the Pacific. Elena had helped with casualty evacuation and damage assessment, working alongside men who still knew her only as Eddie Vasquez, a competent pilot with an unusual combination of skill and intensity. That evening, Major Williams had found Elena in the squadron maintenance hangar, sitting beside the wreckage of Esperanza while contemplating the randomness that separated survival from sacrifice. The conversation that followed had been brief, conducted in voices that carried the weight of shared understanding. "I've arranged for you to receive a replacement aircraft," Major Williams had said. "A new P-51D with the latest modifications. What do you want to name her?" Elena had looked at the twisted metal that had been her companion through months of combat, thinking about dreams and determination, about the prices paid for challenging conventions and the costs of accepting limitations. "Verdad," she'd answered. Truth. The morning that would change everything began with intelligence reports that should have been routine. Japanese naval forces were consolidating near Rabaul, apparently preparing for a major offensive that could threaten Allied shipping lanes throughout the Central Pacific. Elena's squadron had been tasked with long-range reconnaissance and interdiction, missions that would push both aircraft and pilots to their operational limits. But routine had become a luxury that the Pacific Theater could no longer afford. As Elena preflighted her new Mustang Verdad gleaming in morning sunlight with fresh paint and untested systems, Colonel Harrison arrived at Henderson Field with an entourage that included war correspondents, congressional observers, and senior military officials whose presence suggested that something far beyond normal operations was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Harrison had announced to the assembled group, his voice carrying across the flight line with the authority of someone accustomed to shaping narratives, "You're about to witness the kind of aerial combat that's winning this war. These pilots represent the finest fighting force ever assembled, men whose courage and skill are legendary throughout the Pacific." Elena had continued her pre-flight inspection while listening to words that praised achievements she'd helped create while celebrating an identity that excluded her existence. The irony had become familiar over months of living this contradiction. But familiarity hadn't diminished its sting. She was simultaneously present and absent, celebrated and invisible, essential and denied. The mission briefing had been conducted with unusual formality, reflecting the presence of observers who would carry their impressions back to Washington decision-makers. Captain Thompson had outlined objectives and tactical considerations, while Elena and her squadron mates had listened with the professional attention that survival demanded. But beneath the routine military procedure, Elena had sensed undercurrents of tension that suggested hidden agendas and unstated purposes. Primary objective is reconnaissance of enemy naval concentrations, Thompson had explained, indicating positions on a map that showed the vast distances separating Allied bases from Japanese strongholds. Secondary objective is interdiction of any enemy aircraft threatening our reconnaissance effort. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. Anything flying a rising sun is fair game. The journalists had scribbled notes and operated cameras with the enthusiasm of people documenting history in progress. Elena had wondered what stories they would tell. What version of truth would reach American audiences who needed heroes more than they needed complexity? Her own story would remain classified, reduced to footnotes in reports that attributed her achievements to someone who'd never existed. Launch had proceeded smoothly. 12 P-51 Mustangs lifting off from Henderson Field's Coral Runway in formation. That spoke of countless hours of training and operational experience. Elena had taken her position as wingman to Captain Morrison, maintaining the kind of precise flying that looked effortless but demanded constant attention to detail. The Pacific stretched beneath them like hammered metal, its surface broken only by coral atolls that served as navigation, markers on a route toward enemy territory. Radio communications had been minimal during the transit, pilots maintaining radio discipline while scanning constantly for enemy interceptors that might appear without warning. Elena had used the flight time to review intelligence summaries and tactical considerations, preparing for engagements that could develop faster than conscious thought could process. Combat had taught her that survival depended on decisions made before situations required them. The first enemy contact had come exactly as intelligence had predicted: reconnaissance aircraft operating at maximum range from Japanese bases, probing Allied dispositions with the systematic thoroughness that characterized enemy planning. Elena had spotted them first, 12 aircraft flying in loose formation at an altitude that suggested they were more interested in gathering information than engaging in combat. Bandits, 2 o'clock high, Angels 20, she'd reported, her voice calm despite adrenaline that made her hands tingle with hyper-awareness. Looks like Kate's with fighter escort. Captain Morrison had acknowledged her report and begun maneuvering the formation for an intercept that would prevent the enemy aircraft from completing their reconnaissance mission. The tactical situation was straightforward: prevent enemy intelligence gathering while accomplishing their own objectives. But straightforward didn't mean simple, and simple didn't mean safe. The engagement had developed with the kind of explosive suddenness that transformed peaceful sky into a three-dimensional battlefield where physics encouraged determined outcomes. Elena had found herself pursuing a Japanese fighter whose pilot demonstrated the kind of tactical sophistication that marked experienced combat veterans. Their duel had carried them away from the main engagement, altitude and energy becoming weapons as important as guns and ammunition. Elena's opponent had been skilled enough to recognize her capabilities and adjust his tactics accordingly. Instead of attempting to outmaneuver the Mustang in sustained combat, he'd tried to extend the engagement until fuel limitations forced her to disengage. But Elena had anticipated this strategy, had calculated fuel consumption rates and engagement parameters that would allow her to maintain combat effectiveness while preserving enough reserves for the return flight to Henderson Field. The duel had ended when Elena had managed to position herself for a deflection shot that caught the enemy aircraft just as it entered a climbing turn. Her .50 caliber rounds had found their target with devastating effect, transforming a sophisticated war machine into falling debris in the space between heartbeats. She'd watched the enemy pilot bail out successfully, his parachute opening properly as he descended toward the Pacific's indifferent embrace. But as Elena had rejoined the Formation for the return flight to Henderson Field. She'd noticed something that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. One of the war correspondent's aircraft, a B-25, Mitchell configured for photography and observation, had been following the engagement at a discreet distance, its cameras recording everything for audiences who would never know the complete truth about what they were witnessing. The return flight had given Elena time to consider implications that extended far beyond the tactical success of their mission. Somewhere in that aircraft's cameras was footage of her combat performance, visual evidence that would be analyzed by experts who might notice details that careful observers had missed. Her flying style, her tactical decisions, her physical mannerisms, all captured on film that would be reviewed by people trained to detect anomalies and inconsistencies. Landing at Henderson Field had felt like returning to a stage where performance was mandatory and the stakes were catastrophic. Elena had taxied Verdad to her designated parking spot, while maintaining the masculine swagger that had become second nature, acknowledging congratulations from ground crews who'd monitored the mission's progress through radio communications. But she'd sensed something different in their attention, a quality of scrutiny that suggested her situation was changing in ways she couldn't control. The post-mission briefing had been conducted in the same secure conference room where Elena's true identity had first been revealed to military officials. But now the room held additional occupants, the war correspondents who'd witnessed the mission, congressional observers whose questions would influence future military policy, and senior officers whose decisions affected thousands of personnel. Throughout the Pacific Theater, outstanding mission execution, Colonel Harrison had begun, his praise encompassing the entire squadron while his eyes focused on Elena with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every detail of her appearance and demeanor. Textbook interception, clean engagement, complete mission success. The kind of performance that demonstrates American air superiority. The journalists had asked predictable questions about aircraft performance, pilot training, and the strategic significance of air-to-air combat in the Pacific Theater. Elena had answered carefully, providing enough detail to satisfy their curiosity while avoiding specifics that might compromise operational security or reveal inconsistencies in her carefully constructed identity. But one correspondent, a woman named Margaret Foster from Life magazine, had asked questions that demonstrated understanding of aviation that went beyond casual interest. Her inquiries about aircraft handling characteristics, tactical decision-making, and combat stress had revealed knowledge that could only come from personal flying experience or extensive research into military aviation. Airman Vasquez, Foster, had said, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that masked deeper investigation, "Your combat reports demonstrate unusual tactical sophistication. Your situational awareness and energy management suggest flying experience that goes beyond standard military training. Have you had civilian flying experience?" Elena had felt the attention of everyone in the room focus on her like spotlights, converging on a stage performer. Her answer would need to satisfy professional curiosity while maintaining the biographical fiction that supported her military service. Too much detail would invite additional scrutiny, while too little would suggest evasion that might trigger more intensive investigation. "Yes, ma'am," Elena had replied, falling back on prepared responses that had been developed during her initial briefings. "I grew up on a ranch where we maintained our own aircraft for crop dusting and transportation. Started flying when I was 16, built up considerable experience before enlisting." Margaret Foster had nodded, making notes that seemed to contain more information than Elena's answer had provided. Interesting background. Rural aviation experience often produces pilots with exceptional improvisational skills, the kind of adaptability that translates well to combat situations. The briefing had continued for another hour, covering topics that ranged from tactical recommendations to strategic implications of air superiority in the Pacific Theater. Elena had participated appropriately, providing insights that demonstrated her understanding of aerial warfare, while avoiding comments that might attract additional attention to her individual performance. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. But as the session had concluded, Elena had noticed Margaret Foster approaching Major Williams for a private conversation that looked anything but casual. The two women had spoken in voices too low to overhear, but their body language had suggested the kind of professional discussion that occurred between people who shared common interests and mutual respect. That evening, Elena had been summoned to Colonel Harrison's office for what had been described as a routine administrative meeting. But the presence of Major Williams, Captain Thompson, and Margaret Foster had indicated that routine had been abandoned in favor of something far more significant and potentially dangerous. "Sit down, Vasquez," Colonel Harrison had said, his tone carrying the weight of decisions that had already been made rather than options that remained under consideration. "We need to discuss your future with this command." Elena had taken the offered chair while scanning the faces around her for clues about what kind of future was being contemplated. Major Williams had looked professionally neutral. Captain Thompson had seemed concerned, and Margaret Foster had displayed the kind of alert attention that characterized experienced investigators presented with compelling subjects. "Miss Foster has been conducting research for a story about exceptional military performance," Colonel Harrison had continued. "Her investigation has raised questions about certain aspects of your background and service record, questions that require careful consideration." Margaret Foster had opened the file that contained documents. Elena had never seen photographs, transcripts, official records that seemed to chronicle her entire life from birth through military service. The thoroughness of the investigation was both impressive and terrifying, suggesting resources and authority that extended far beyond routine journalism. "Elena Maria Vasquez," Foster had said, using Elena's real name for the first time in military surroundings. Born El Paso, Texas, 1921. Graduated high school with honors. Worked as aircraft mechanic. Enlisted under false identity in 1942. Currently serving as combat pilot with distinction that has drawn attention from senior military officials and congressional oversight committees. The revelation had landed in the office like an unexploded bomb, its implications clear to everyone present. Elena's secret was no longer secret. Her carefully constructed identity had been penetrated by investigation that had apparently been ongoing for weeks or months. The game was over, but the consequences remained to be determined. "The question," Colonel Harrison had said, his voice carefully neutral, "is what we do with this information. Miss Foster represents editorial interests that could make this story public knowledge within days. Such publicity would have significant implications for military policy, congressional oversight, and ongoing operations." Elena had found herself in a position she dreaded since beginning her military service. Discovered, exposed, vulnerable to consequences that could extend far beyond her individual situation. But instead of panic or despair, she'd felt something. That might have been relief. The exhausting burden of constant deception was finally lifting, replaced by whatever truth would bring. "What do you want from me?" Elena had asked, directing the question to Margaret Foster rather than the military officials whose authority she understood. Foster had smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Elena had seen from her. "I want to tell your story. The real story, not the sanitized version that attributes your achievements to someone who doesn't exist. I want the American people to know that one of their most effective combat pilots is a woman who's been serving with distinction while maintaining an identity that military policy required." The conversation that had followed had lasted through the night and into the following morning, covering topics that included editorial responsibility, military security, political implications, and the personal consequences of public disclosure. Elena had found herself at the center of decisions that would affect not just her own future, but the possibilities available to women throughout American society. Major Williams had argued for continued secrecy, emphasizing the experimental nature of Elena's service and the institutional opposition that premature disclosure might generate. Captain Thompson had supported Elena's right to recognition, pointing out that her combat record spoke for itself regardless of gender considerations. Colonel Harrison had maintained official neutrality while clearly preferring solutions that minimized disruption to existing policies and procedures, but Margaret Foster had presented arguments that transcended military concerns to address broader questions of social justice and democratic values. She described the hundreds of women serving in support roles throughout the military, the thousands working in defense industries, the millions contributing to the war effort while being denied opportunities that their capabilities clearly warranted. "This isn't just about Elena Vasquez," Foster had said, her voice carrying conviction that came from personal experience with institutional discrimination. "This is about every woman who's been told that her gender disqualifies her from serving her country in roles that match her abilities. Elena has proven that those limitations are artificial, based on prejudice rather than performance." The debate had continued until dawn, when Colonel Harrison had finally called for a decision that would determine Elena's fate and potentially influence military policy for generations to come. The choice had been presented as Elena's to make, though the options came with consequences that extended far beyond her individual preferences. She could continue serving under her male identity, maintaining the secrecy that had allowed her to reach this point, while accepting that her achievements would never be officially attributed to her true identity. Or she could allow Margaret Foster to publish her story, accepting the risks that came with public disclosure, while potentially opening doors for other women who dreamed of similar opportunities. Elena had thought about her grandfather's medal, pressing against her chest like a tangible connection to 3 generations of men who'd faced their own impossible choices. She'd considered her parents' expectations, her brother's dreams, the promises she'd made and the prices she'd paid. But most of all, she'd thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whose death had reminded her that some things were worth the ultimate sacrifice. "Publish the story," Elena had said, her voice carrying finality that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "Tell the truth. All of it." The story broke on a Tuesday morning that began like any other at Henderson Field, with the mechanical sounds of aircraft engines warming up for dawn patrol and the familiar rhythm of military routine that had become Elena's daily reality. But by noon, radio messages from Pearl Harbor and Washington were flooding the communications center with requests for confirmation, clarification, and comment on a story that was transforming from military news into national sensation. Margaret Foster's article in Life magazine had been titled "The Girl Who Flew, America's Secret Woman Fighter Pilot," and it had accomplished exactly what Elena had hoped and feared it would. The piece included photographs of her in flight gear beside Verdad, detailed accounts of her combat missions, and testimonials from squadron mates who'd learned her true identity only hours before publication. But more importantly, it had presented her story within the broader context of women's contributions to the war effort and their potential for expanded roles in American society. The reaction had been immediate and polarizing. Congressional offices were flooded with letters from constituents who either praised Elena's courage or condemned the military's deception. Women's organizations hailed her as proof that gender limitations were artificial barriers that served no legitimate purpose. Veterans groups split between those who respected her combat record and those who felt that her presence undermined unit cohesion and military tradition. Colonel Harrison had summoned Elena to his office within hours of the story's publication, his expression reflecting the kind of professional stress that came from dealing with situations for which military training provided no adequate preparation. The phone on his desk had been ringing constantly, and his staff had been fielding calls from reporters, politicians, and military officials whose authority extended far beyond the Pacific Theater. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Vasquez," he'd said, using her real name and her newly authorized rank for the first time in official conversation. "You've managed to accomplish something I didn't think was possible. You've made military aviation policy front-page news across the entire country." The promotion had been unexpected, processed through channels that Elena hadn't known existed. Her combat record, previously attributed to the fictional Eddie Vasquez, had been officially transferred to her real identity, along with decorations that included the Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 air medals. The bureaucratic sleight of hand had been impressive, transforming months of classified service into an official record that matched her actual achievements. "What happens now?" Elena had asked, genuinely uncertain about her status within a military system that had never anticipated her situation. Colonel Harrison had handed her a file thick with documents that represented weeks of careful planning by officials who'd prepared for various contingencies. "Now you become the test case for policies that don't exist yet. The War Department has established a special advisory committee to evaluate women's roles in combat positions. You'll be their primary source of operational data." The committee had been chaired by General Claire Chennault, the legendary commander of the Flying Tigers, whose experience with unconventional tactics had prepared him for situations that challenged military orthodoxy. Elena had been interviewed by panel members who included combat veterans, aviation experts, and policy specialists whose recommendations would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The sessions had been conducted in secure facilities, where Elena's experiences could be documented without compromising ongoing operations. She described her training, her combat missions, her integration with male squadron members, and the practical considerations that had affected her performance in various situations. The questions had been thorough and professional, designed to extract information that could guide future policy decisions. "Lieutenant Vasquez," General Chennault had said during their final session, "your service record demonstrates capabilities that equal or exceed those of male pilots with similar experience. Your integration with existing units appears to have been successful, with minimal disruption to unit cohesion or operational effectiveness. Do you believe these results could be replicated with other qualified women?" Elena had considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would influence opportunities for countless women who might follow her path. Her response needed to balance honest assessment with recognition of the broader implications that extended beyond her individual experience. "Yes, sir, with proper selection and training. Flying ability and combat effectiveness aren't determined by gender, they're functions of skill, training, and mental capacity. There are women throughout this country who have the qualifications to serve as combat pilots if given the opportunity." The committee's recommendations had been classified, but their effects had become visible within weeks. The military had quietly begun evaluating female personnel for expanded roles, testing policies that would allow women to serve in positions previously reserved for men. The changes had been gradual and carefully managed, but they'd represented fundamental shifts in institutional thinking that Elena's service had made possible. Meanwhile, Elena's squadron had adapted to her new status with the same pragmatic professionalism that characterized military units focused on mission accomplishment. Her squadron mates had known her as a competent pilot. Learning her true identity had changed their understanding of her background, but not their assessment of her capabilities. Captain Thompson had summarized the squadron's attitude during a brief but memorable conversation. "Vasquez," he'd said, dropping the elaborate formality that had characterized their previous interactions, "I don't care if you're a woman, a Martian, or a trained chimpanzee. You can fly and fight better than most of the pilots I've commanded. That's all that matters in this business." The acceptance had been validating in ways that Elena hadn't anticipated. Her competence had earned respect that transcended gender. Considerations, creating relationships based on professional capability rather than social expectations. The squadron had become a microcosm of what might be possible if merit, rather than prejudice, determined opportunity. But Elena's visibility had also created challenges that went beyond military considerations. She'd received thousands of letters from women across the country, some seeking advice about pursuing military careers, others describing their own struggles with gender discrimination, many simply expressing gratitude that someone had challenged barriers that had seemed insurmountable. Each letter had represented individual dreams and aspirations that Elena's service had made more attainable. Reading them had been simultaneously inspiring and overwhelming, a constant reminder of the responsibility that came with being first. Her success or failure wouldn't just affect her own future, but the possibilities available to women whose names she'd never know, but whose opportunities she'd helped create. The media attention had been intense and largely positive, though not without controversy. Elena had been featured on magazine covers, interviewed by radio programs, and invited to speak at events that celebrated women's contributions to the war effort. But she'd also faced criticism from those who believed that her service violated natural order or military tradition. Some of the opposition had been predictable traditional organizations that viewed women's expanded roles as threats to established social structures. But other criticism had come from unexpected sources, including women who felt that Elena's military service diminished the value of more conventional feminine contributions to society. Elena had tried to address these concerns during public appearances that had been carefully managed by military public relations specialists. Her message had been consistent. She wasn't advocating for all women to become combat pilots, but for all women to have opportunities that matched their individual capabilities and interests. "I'm not trying to prove that all women should do what I've done," she'd said during one memorable radio interview. "I'm trying to prove that qualified women should have the same opportunities as qualified men. Some women will choose traditional roles, others will choose different paths. The important thing is that the choice should be based on individual merit rather than arbitrary limitations." The war had continued throughout Elena's transformation from secret to celebrity, and she'd remained an active combat pilot even as her public profile had grown. Her mission assignments had been carefully selected to balance operational necessity with security considerations, but she'd continued flying combat missions that contributed to the Allied advance across the Pacific. Her combat record had grown to include 8 confirmed aerial victories, making her one of the war's more successful fighter pilots regardless of gender considerations. Each victory had been documented by gun camera footage and verified by witnesses, creating an official record that demonstrated women's potential for combat effectiveness. But Elena had found greater satisfaction in missions that supported ground operations, close air support for Marine infantry units, interdiction of enemy supply lines, escort duties for transport aircraft carrying wounded personnel to medical facilities. These missions had lacked the dramatic appeal of aerial combat, but they'd represented the everyday reality of military aviation that rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. The war's end had come suddenly, announced through radio broadcasts that reached Henderson Field during what had been planned as a routine maintenance day. Elena had been in the squadron hangar when the news arrived, working with her new crew chief, a replacement for Rodriguez who'd been selected, partly for his experience with unconventional situations. The celebration had been subdued, marked more by relief than jubilation. Too many friends had been lost. Too much destruction had been witnessed. Too many scars had been accumulated for victory to feel purely triumphant. Elena had participated in the mandatory festivities while privately mourning losses that would never be fully understood by those who hadn't shared the experience. Demobilization had presented new challenges as Elena transitioned from military Service to civilian life in a society that was rapidly changing but still constrained by traditional expectations. The GI Bill had provided educational opportunities, but many employers remained reluctant to hire women for positions that had been opened by wartime necessity, but were expected to return to male exclusivity. Elena had used her veterans' benefits to pursue an aeronautical engineering degree, combining her practical flying experience with theoretical knowledge that prepared her for careers in aviation design and testing. Her reputation had opened doors that might have remained closed to other women, but it had also created expectations that sometimes felt as limiting as the barriers she'd overcome. The aircraft industry had been eager to employ someone whose combat experience provided insights into aircraft performance under extreme conditions. Elena had joined North American Aviation as a test pilot, evaluating new aircraft designs and contributing to development programs that would influence aviation for decades to come. Her work had been technically challenging and professionally satisfying, but it had lacked the emotional intensity that had characterized her military service. Test flying was safer than combat, but safety had eliminated the sense of absolute purpose that had made every mission feel essential. Elena had found herself missing aspects of war that she knew she shouldn't romanticize. The Korean conflict had provided an opportunity to return to military service, though in a different capacity than her World War II role. Elena had been commissioned as a major in the Air Force Reserve, serving as an advisor to units that were integrating women into expanded military occupations. Her experience had been valuable for developing policies that avoided problems that earlier integration efforts had encountered. By 1953, Elena had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the Pentagon, where she'd worked on strategic planning that incorporated lessons learned from women's wartime service. The assignment had been politically sensitive but professionally rewarding, allowing her to influence policies that would affect generations of military women. 3 years after the war ended, Elena stood on the runway at Edwards Air Force Base, watching test pilots prepare for flights that would push aircraft beyond the boundaries of sound itself. The desert morning was crisp with promise, and the experimental jets lined up on the tarmac represented humanity's relentless drive to transcend limitations that had once seemed absolute. As the first woman to serve as chief test pilot for the X-Series program, she'd found herself at the center of aviation's next revolution. Her marriage to Captain James Morrison, her former wing commander, had surprised everyone, including themselves. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared experiences that few people could understand, and mutual respect that had deepened through years of working together. Jimmy, as she'd learned to call him away from military formality, had been one of the few men who'd known her true identity from the beginning and had never treated her differently because of it. Their wedding had been a media event despite their preferences for privacy. Elena had worn her dress uniform rather than traditional bridal attire, a choice that had generated controversy and admiration in equal measure. The ceremony had been conducted at the Air Force Academy Chapel, with squadron members from her Pacific Theater service forming an honor guard that included both men and women, a sight that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. The X-1 gleamed orange and silver in the morning sun, its rocket engine representing technology that seemed more like science fiction than aeronautical engineering. Elena had been selected to pilot the aircraft's 15th powered flight, an assignment that would test modifications designed to improve control at transonic speeds. The mission would take her closer to the sound barrier than any woman had ever flown. As she completed her pre-flight inspection, Elena reflected on the changes that her wartime service had helped accelerate. The Women's Armed Services Integration Act had been signed into law in 1948, officially allowing women to serve as permanent members of the armed forces rather than auxiliary personnel. The legislation had been influenced partly by documentation of women's wartime performance, including Elena's own service record. But progress had been uneven, constrained by cultural attitudes that proved more resistant to change than military regulations. Women could serve in the military, but combat roles remained largely closed. They could work in aviation, but commercial airlines still refused to hire female pilots. Legal barriers had been lowered, but social expectations continued to limit opportunities. Elena climbed into the X-1's cramped cockpit, running through checklists that had become as familiar as breathing. The experimental aircraft was unlike anything she'd flown during the war. No guns, no external threats, just the pure challenge of pushing human knowledge forward one flight at a time. The mission was peaceful in purpose, but no less dangerous than aerial combat. The B-29 mothership lifted off with the X-1 secured beneath its belly, climbing to altitude where the rocket plane would be released for its brief but spectacular flight. Elena monitored instruments and communications, while thinking about the young women who'd begun appearing at test pilot schools and aviation programs across the country. Her visibility had encouraged others to pursue careers that previous generations of women had never considered possible. At 30,000 feet, Elena felt the familiar sensation of release as the X-1 separated from the mother ship and began its independent flight. The rocket engine ignited with a kick that pressed her into the seat, accelerating the aircraft towards speeds that challenged both machine and pilot. The desert landscape fell away below while the sky ahead turned deeper shades of blue that promised the edge of space. The flight lasted only 10 minutes, but those minutes contained discoveries that would influence aircraft design for decades to come. Elena's careful observations of control response and stability characteristics provided data that engineers would analyze for months, each detail contributing to humanity's understanding of high-speed flight. Landing on the dry lake bed at Edwards, Elena was greeted by ground crews who treated her achievement as routine, exactly the kind of acceptance she'd dreamed of during her early military service. Her gender was noted but not remarkable, her competence assumed rather than questioned. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. 10 years after the war, Elena's daughter Sarah played in the backyard of their home near Edwards Air Force Base, building model airplanes with the same intense concentration that Elena had brought to her own childhood mechanical projects. At 8 years old, Sarah had already announced her intention to become an astronaut, a career that didn't yet exist but that Elena was certain would become reality within her daughter's lifetime. "Mommy, why do some people say girls can't be pilots?" Sarah had asked one evening, having overheard comments at a school event that reminded Elena how much work remained to be done. Elena had knelt beside her daughter, choosing words carefully. "Some people have old ideas about what women can do, but ideas change when people prove them wrong. Your job is to be the best at whatever you choose to do, and not let other people's ideas limit your dreams." The Korean War had provided Elena with another opportunity to serve in combat, though in a different capacity than her World War II role. As a squadron commander, she'd led missions over North Korea while also mentoring the first generation of women who'd been trained specifically for military aviation roles. The experience had been professionally satisfying but emotionally complex, as Elena had struggled to balance leadership responsibilities with her desire to remain an active pilot. Her promotion to full colonel had come with assignment to the Pentagon, where she'd worked on strategic planning for the next generation of military aircraft. The position had been influential but frustrating, as bureaucratic processes moved far more slowly than the technological developments they were supposed to guide. Elena had found herself caught between her understanding of what was possible and institutional resistance to change. 20 years after the war. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in 1965, bearing the presidential seal and an invitation that Elena had never expected to receive. President Johnson was establishing a commission to study the status of women in American society, and Elena had been asked to serve as the military representative on a panel that would influence federal policy for generations to come, the commissions. Work had been comprehensive and occasionally contentious, examining everything from employment discrimination to educational opportunities, to legal barriers that limited women's participation in various aspects of American life. Elena had contributed insights based on her unique experience of breaking barriers. While serving in traditionally male roles, the final report had been revolutionary in its scope and recommendations, calling for systematic elimination of gender-based discrimination in employment, education, and legal rights. Elena's military experience had provided concrete examples of women's capabilities in high-stress, high-responsibility positions that directly contradicted arguments about natural limitations or inherent differences in ability. But the commission's work had also revealed how much remained to be accomplished. Despite legal changes and expanding opportunities, cultural attitudes continued to constrain women's choices and limit their advancement in many fields. Progress was occurring, but at a pace that frustrated those who understood how much potential was being wasted. Elena's own career had evolved from test pilot to program manager to senior executive, positions that allowed her to influence the development of advanced aircraft while mentoring younger women who were entering aviation careers. She'd become a bridge between generations, helping to translate the possibilities her wartime service had demonstrated into opportunities that others could pursue. 30 years after the war. The invitation to speak at the Air Force Academies graduation ceremony had been both an honor and a reminder of how much had changed since Elena's own military service. The graduating class of 1975 included 37 women, young officers who would begin their careers in a military that officially welcomed female participation. Even if cultural acceptance remained incomplete, Elena's speech had focused on the importance of competence over convention, performance over prejudice. She'd told the graduates about her own experiences without dwelling on the obstacles she'd overcome, emphasizing instead the satisfaction that came from serving something larger than personal ambition. Your gender, your background, your previous experiences, none of these matter as much as your willingness to serve with distinction, she'd told the audience. The military needs your talents, your perspectives, and your dedication. Focus on being exceptional at what you do, and let your performance speak for itself. After the ceremony, Elena had been approached by several female graduates who'd grown up reading about her wartime service and had been inspired to pursue military careers. Their questions had been thoughtful and practical, focused on managing dual roles as military officers and women in a society that sometimes struggled to reconcile those identities. "Ma'am," one young lieutenant had asked, "how do you balance being true to yourself with meeting expectations that might conflict with who you are?" Elena had considered the question carefully, remembering her own struggles with identity and authenticity during her early military service. "You don't have to choose between being a woman and being an officer," she'd finally answered. "You have to choose to be the best version of yourself, regardless of what other people think that should look like." 40 years after the war, Elena's retirement from active duty had been marked by ceremonies that celebrated not just her individual achievements, but the broader changes her service had helped create. The Air Force of 1985 included women in roles that had been unimaginable during World War II: pilots, navigators, maintenance specialists, commanders at every level of the organization. But perhaps more significantly, their presence was no longer remarkable. Women's military service had become routine rather than exceptional, normal rather than noteworthy. Elena's early struggles to prove that women could serve effectively in combat roles had evolved into institutional acceptance that competence, rather than gender-determined suitability for military positions. Her memoir, published shortly after retirement, had become a bestseller that introduced new generations to the story of women's wartime contributions. Elena had written honestly about the challenges and contradictions of her service, the personal costs of living a double identity, and the satisfaction of knowing that her struggles had opened doors for others. The book had been adapted into a film that took considerable dramatic license with historical facts but captured the essential truth of Elena's experience, that barriers existed to be broken, that limitations were often artificial constructs rather than natural law, and that individual courage could create institutional change. 50 years after the war. The dedication of the Elena Vasquez Center for Aviation Excellence at Edwards Air Force Base had been scheduled to coincide with the 50th anniversary of VJ Day, a symbolic connection between Elena's wartime service and her subsequent contributions to military aviation. The facility would serve as a training center for the next generation of test pilots, both male and female, who would push the boundaries of flight toward destinations that Elena's generation had only imagined. Elena, now in her 70s but still sharp-eyed and straight-backed, had delivered the dedication speech to an audience that included aerospace industry executives, military officials, and young people who represented the future of aviation. Her words had been carefully chosen to honor the past while inspiring continued progress. 50 years ago, people said that girls don't fly, she'd begun, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. Today, women command space shuttles, lead fighter squadrons, and design aircraft that push the boundaries of what's possible. But the most important lesson isn't about gender, it's about the danger of accepting limitations that aren't based on evidence. The ceremony had concluded with a flyover by the Thunderbirds, the Air Force's demonstration team that now included female pilots, whose presence would have been impossible during Elena's early military career. The formation had been perfect, a testament to the skill and professionalism that transcended any consideration of the pilots' backgrounds or personal characteristics. 60 years after the war. Elena, single quotes, S. granddaughter Maria, named for the girl who'd taught Elena to dance at parish socials so many decades earlier, was preparing for her own military deployment as a combat pilot in Operation Iraqi Freedom. The young woman bore a striking resemblance to Elena at the same age, with the same determined expression and natural confidence that suggested great things were possible. Abuela, Maria had said during their final conversation before deployment, using the Spanish endearment that connected them to family traditions that had survived war, social change, and generational differences. I've been reading about your service, about what it was like when you had to pretend to be someone else. I can't imagine having to hide who I am just to do my job. Elena had smiled, remembering her own disbelief at the obstacles that had seemed insurmountable during her youth. You don't have to imagine it, Mia, because other people fought those battles, so you wouldn't have to. Your job is to be excellent at what you do and to keep the doors open for whoever comes after you. The conversation had taken place in Elena's study, surrounded by photographs and memorabilia from a lifetime of service that had spanned from propeller-driven fighters to space shuttles. The walls told the story of American aviation's evolution, but more importantly, they documented the gradual expansion of opportunities for people who'd been excluded from those achievements by artificial barriers rather than natural limitations. Maria's deployment had been routine in ways that Elena's wartime service could never have been. Female combat pilots were no longer experimental or exceptional. They were simply part of the military's operational capabilities, evaluated on performance rather than novelty. The transformation had taken decades, but it was now so complete that young women like Maria couldn't imagine any other reality. Present day. 2005. Elena celebrated her 84th birthday at a gathering that included family members from 4 generations, military colleagues from 6 decades of service, and aerospace industry leaders who continued to benefit from innovations that her generation had pioneered. The party had been held at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where Elena's wartime Mustang, restored to its original Esperanza configuration, was displayed as part of an exhibit on women's contributions to aviation. Sarah, now a NASA administrator overseeing human spaceflight programs, had delivered a toast that captured both Elena's individual achievements and their broader significance for American society. My mother taught me that barriers exist to be broken, that limitations are often imaginary, and that the word impossible is usually just the beginning of an interesting conversation. The celebration had concluded with Elena standing before the restored Mustang, her hand resting on the propeller blade as she remembered the young woman who'd climbed into similar cockpits so many years earlier. The aircraft looked smaller then. She remembered, its aluminum skin polished to mirror brightness that reflected the museum's lights like captured starlight. Visitors approached throughout the evening, some recognizing Elena from photographs and documentaries, others simply curious about the elderly woman who seemed so comfortable beside the vintage fighter. Each conversation had been an opportunity to share stories about aviation's golden age and the people who'd transformed dreams into reality through determination and skill. "Ma'am," a young girl had asked, her voice carrying the kind of innocent curiosity that cut through decades of accumulated experience to reach fundamental truths, "what was it like to be the first woman to do what you did?" Elena had knelt to the child's eye level, thinking about all the women who'd followed paths that her service had helped create. Scary and exciting and lonely and wonderful, all at the same time. But mostly, it felt like doing exactly what I was supposed to do, even when other people didn't understand why. As the evening had wound down and guests had begun departing for their various destinations, Elena had remained beside the Mustang for a few final minutes of private reflection. The museum had grown quiet, its vast spaces filled with the hushed reverence that seemed appropriate for institutions dedicated to preserving humanity's greatest achievements. She'd thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whose death had crystallized her determination to complete their shared mission. About Major Williams, whose courage had made Elena's service possible. About her parents, who'd lived to see their daughter receive recognition that had been delayed but not denied. About all the women whose names would never be known, but whose dreams had been made more attainable by the paths that Elena's generation had pioneered. The museum's security guard had approached respectfully, indicating that closing time was approaching. Elena had nodded and prepared to leave, but not before placing her hand one final time on the aircraft that had carried her through the most important chapter of her life. "Thank you, old friend," she'd whispered to the silent Mustang. "We did good work together." Walking toward the museum's exit, Elena had passed displays chronicling aviation's evolution from the Wright brothers' first flight to the International Space Station's orbital achievements. Each exhibit represented dreams that had been transformed into reality by people who'd refused to accept that limitations were permanent, or that progress was impossible. At the museum's entrance, Elena had paused to read the inscription carved into the marble wall. "The sky is not the limit, it's just the beginning." The words captured perfectly the spirit that had driven her generation to push beyond accepted boundaries, to prove that human potential was constrained more by imagination than by physics. Outside, the night sky was clear enough to reveal stars that had guided aviators for generations and would continue, inspiring future dreamers long after Elena's own story had become history. She'd looked up at those distant lights and remembered the young woman who'd once believed that flying was the closest thing to touching infinity that humans could achieve. Elena's driver had been waiting patiently beside a car that would take her home to the same house near Edwards Air Force Base, where she'd raised her children and planned missions that had expanded the boundaries of human flight. The journey would be short, but it would carry her through a landscape transformed by decades of technological progress and social change that her own service had helped create. As the car had pulled away from the museum, Elena had watched the building's lights fade in the rearview mirror, knowing that her story would continue inspiring others long after she was gone. The exhibits would preserve the artifacts of her achievements, but the real legacy lived in the opportunities available to women who would never have to disguise their identities to pursue their dreams. The final entry in Elena's personal journal, written that night in handwriting that remained steady despite her advanced age, captured both the satisfaction of a life well lived and the hope that future generations would build upon foundations that her generation had established. Today, I was surrounded by family and friends who represent the best of what America can become when opportunity is determined by merit rather than prejudice. The young women at the party, pilots, engineers, scientists, leaders in fields that were close to women when I was their age, they are my true legacy. Not the aircraft I flew or the records I set, but the possibilities their existence represents. The war taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear when action serves something larger than personal comfort. Breaking barriers was frightening, but accepting limitations would have been a betrayal of every woman who deserved chances she was never given. I'm proud of what we accomplished, but I'm prouder of what others have built upon those achievements. The sky truly isn't the limit, it's just the beginning of possibilities that expand with each generation's refusal to accept that impossible is the final answer. Elena closed the journal and placed it on the bedside table beside a photograph of herself in flight gear, standing beside Esperanza on a Henderson Field morning that seemed simultaneously distant and immediate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities for people whose dreams were made possible by yesterday's courage. But tonight, she would sleep peacefully, knowing that the words, "girls don't fly," had been transformed from statement of limitation into reminder of progress achieved through determination, skill, and the unwavering belief that human potential was limited only by human imagination. The last light in Elena's house went out just after midnight, but her legacy would continue inspiring dreamers for generations to come, proving that barriers existed not to stop progress, but to provide targets for those brave enough to believe that impossible was just another word for the next mountain to climb. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.